Hey everyone, welcome to our lecture on thermal physiology. So our goals today are to talk about the different strategies that animals use in order to regulate their temperature and explain some of the physiology that goes into thermal tolerance. So when we look at an animal in its environment, there's a number of different factors that can come into play when it comes to regulating their body temperature. They're going to be influenced by the fluid that they're moving through, so be that water or be that air. They'll be influenced by solid surfaces if they are terrestrial animals, so what is the temperature of the substrate? We're looking at, this radiant temperature overall. So animals have a lot of different areas that they're kind of contending with in order to regulate their own body temperature. And there are different strategies for regulating your temperature. You can be a poikiotherm, which means that you are going to be open to a wider range of environmental conditions. Your physiology will allow you to exist in a wider range. Or you can be a homeotherm, where you need to maintain a really constant temperature. So if we take a look at this graph on this slide, on the x-axis, you have poikiothermy and homeothermy on the two ends there, with degree of constancy being the label on that axis. So in poikiothermy, you're going to have a wide range of constancy, homeothermy, a much narrower range. And then on that y-axis, we're looking at origins of thermal energy. So you can be an ectotherm or you can be an endotherm, and these terms will be defined on slides coming up. An ectotherm is going to rely on the environment in order to regulate its body temperature. An endotherm is going to rely on metabolism in order to regulate their temperature. So then looking at the animals on this graph, you can see that we have invertebrates, fish, reptiles, and amphibians. Those tend to be poikiotherms, and they also tend to be ectotherms. This makes sense. The environment is not going to stay completely constant all the time. So if you're an ectotherm, it's probably a better strategy to be open to a wide range of environmental variables. Then over on the homeothermy end, now all of these groups tend towards endothermy. So these are ones that are going to regulate their own body temperature using metabolic processes. Then there's a few that kind of fall outside of this continuum. So our torpid birds and mammals, this is like hibernating, torpor. So they're still endotherms, but they are leaning a little bit more towards poikiothermy than homeothermy here. And that's because they are in a metabolic state where they're trying to save resources. So it makes sense that they would get a little bit lax in homeostasis to a degree, right? They can't go wild here, but they can loosen this up a little bit when they're just in a deep sleep. And that is going to ultimately conserve energy for them. Then we have some real just kind of bizarre animals here, like our naked mole rat. Naked mole rats are very, very weird mammals. They have a lot of characteristics that actually make them more reptilian than mammal, but they're bizarre. So they're falling outside the continuum. When we look at really large fish and reptiles, their really large body size actually ends up playing a role here because of that surface area to volume ratio. They're able to maintain a more constant temperature because of their size. And this is the reason why we actually think that dinosaurs were probably homeotherms, even though they were ectotherms as well. And then ice fish are also just a really exceptional group of animals, and we'll talk a little bit later on about what makes this group so exceptional. So when an animal is looking to maintain its body temperature, it's mostly going to want to stay within a relatively narrow range. Um, and within that, it can shift a little bit from different parts of the body. Your core body temperature is what's going to be most important to maintaining vital function of your body. So this is two different thermal images of a human looking at a cold environment and a warm environment. In the cold environment, that blood has been shunted towards vital organs. This is why your toes and your fingers get so cold. When it's cold outside, your body has decided that they're not particularly important, but we need to make sure that your heart and your lungs and your brain are getting plenty of blood. So let's take a look at a graph. And this graph is going to explain metabolic rate and body temperature within the limits of an animal's physiology. So we have metabolic rate on this y-axis. We have body temperature on this y-axis. So our body temperature is the purple line. Metabolic rate is the blue line. And up top, we have this term, thermal neutral zone. And this is the zone in which the animal doesn't have to expend a lot of energy to exist within these temperatures. So ideally, an animal would spend the majority of its life in the thermal neutral zone so that it didn't have to put a whole lot of energy into maintaining its body temperature. So then if we look down below, we have these dotted lines that are coming off of our thermal neutral zone. And on one end, we have the upper critical temperature. So the upper critical temperature is a point where the metabolic rate is going to rise in order to prevent overheating. Then we have the lower critical temperature, where the metabolic rate is going to rise in order to produce more heat. So basically, when you're in the thermal neutral zone, your metabolic rate is going to stay constant. So you see this line isn't shifting at all. And your body temperature is going to stay constant. But once we hit these dotted lines on either end, here you start to see, when you're at the upper end, an increase in metabolic rate in order to actively cool. And we'll talk about different ways that animals do that. So you're actively cooling, you're working pretty hard, and for a certain amount of time, that's going to work, and the body temperature is going to stay stable. So notice how this line is staying flat, while this line is going up. But then there's going to be a point where that is no longer going to be enough. And at that point, the body temperature is going to rise. And once we get beyond this point, then their temperature is going to be outside of a range in which the animal can survive. We see something similar happening on the other end here, where the metabolic rate starts to increase and we have thermogenesis, or shivering. And the body is trying to produce a whole lot of heat. That works for a little while, this line stays flat. And then there's a point where it's just not going to work anymore. And at that point, we have hypothermia, and the animal will die on that end as well. So when we talk about the temperatures at which animals can survive, this is called the incipient lethal temperature. So this is the temperature that has a 50% probability of killing the animal in a certain amount of time. So we have examples of two different fish in these graphs. Fish A is a eurythermal fish, and that means it's more like a poikiotherm, where it's going to have a wider range of environmental conditions that it can tolerate. B is a stenothermal fish, which means it's going to have a much more narrow range that it can fit. So we have lethal temperature on our y-axis and acclimation temperature on our x-axis. So we have a lower limit here still, and this is going to be the point in which the animal has bottomed out. This is the incipient lethal temperature here. And this sloping line is the acclimation point to get to that end. So there is a range at which the animal is going to be okay through slow acclimation, but then there's going to be limits to that as well. So here the flat point is going to be the upper limit of heat. Again, there's this acclimation period as well, where the animal would be okay until it hits this ultimate peak. So if you compare these two graphs here, you can tell there's some differences between this more tolerant species and less tolerant species, where our Uri thermal fish here, this limit doesn't hit until, I don't know, want to call that like 26 degrees. And then on our fish with the more narrow range, this is going to land us at 20 degrees. So that's a 6-degree difference. That's pretty substantial when we're talking about survival. And you see the similar pattern too when we look at the upper limit, where I don't know, we could call this 28 degrees with an upper limit on our eurythermal fish, and we're only hitting a little bit above 20 with the stenothermal fish. So that's how you'll see those patterns shift based on their tolerance to different heat environments. So it's really important to maintain this, this range of appropriate body temperatures for two major reasons. The one is that we have to keep our cell membranes nice and fluid in order for them to work properly. Once our cell membranes are no longer functioning, we die. So that is incredibly important. And this comes into play when we're talking about our lower temperatures, where we start to lose fluidity in that lipid membrane layer. Then the other issue is our enzymes. When we have big shifts in temperature, particularly towards the high end, we denature enzymes. And of course, enzymes also play a tremendous role in our physiology. So this graph is looking at membrane fluidity and temperature. And you can see that our birds and our mammals aren't going to do particularly well when we start to get really cold here. Fluidity is going to decline. And our cold water fish are actually really exceptional. So they have some adaptations that allow them to be in these really cold environments and to still maintain their appropriate level of fluidity in their membranes. So this is an ice fish, and this was the fish that was on that first graph that I said was kind of a bizarre exception. And ice fish have what's called antifreeze proteins. And they're not alone in this. This is a protein that's found in animals that spend a lot of time in deep freezing temperatures. But what these antifreeze proteins do, you can see these little round circles here, they actually sort of wedge themselves between the water molecules, and they prevent ice from forming. And when the ice doesn't form, then you can function a little bit better in these really cold environments. So that's a pretty cool adaptation these guys have. Now our endotherms, not our ectotherms, endotherms are going to be using thermogenesis in order to create heat with their own metabolic processes. And this can look a little bit different, but it's going to be a big heat energy expenditure in order to create the heat for them to survive lower temperatures. So shivering thermogenesis is a big way that the body can produce its own heat. For shivering thermogenesis, your body is basically making your skeletal muscles contract really quickly in order to generate heat as a byproduct. So we know that our muscles are innervated with motor neurons, and that can be consciously controlled and subconsciously controlled. And shivering is not a conscious physiological response, it's a subconscious one, but it's still going to be controlled by those same motor units. And the way that it does this is, instead of sending an action potential that's going to contract the muscle in a synchronous fashion and allow you to actually, move your body, it sends the signal in a uncoordinated asynchronous fashion. So what you end up getting is these muscle contractions without actually moving. Like, you can shiver and you can still pick something up. So it's a subtle difference in the nervous response and how it's actually triggering your muscle to move, and to just so it can get that heat. And it can use both our anaerobic and our aerobic muscle fibers there at different intensities in order to get either, a little shiver or a really intense full body shiver when the situation becomes more dire. Now, mammals are unique in one of their adaptations. They have what's called brown adipose tissue. So this is a special kind of fat that only our mammals have. Our other vertebrates have white adipose tissue, but biochemically it's a little bit different. Our brown adipose tissue has this unique protein in it called thermogenin, and this basically increases the rate of cellular respiration that has heat as a byproduct. So that's a really cool extra adaptation for our mammals. Now, in order for the body to regulate its temperature, it's really a full system effect to put into play here. So first you have to have detection that the temperature is changing internally, and be able to recognize that it needs to be adjusted one way or the other. You have to make sure it goes in the right direction. So you have central nervous system input here, receiving the sensory information. And from there, it's going to have to pull a number of different levers in order to get your body to respond appropriately. So typically one of the first responses is either vasoconstriction or vasodilation. If you are trying to cool the body, you're going to vasodilate. So you're going to make those vessels a little bit bigger. So muscles surrounding those vessels are going to relax. If you've ever noticed on a really hot day, like the veins on your hand might pop out a little bit more, that's vasodilation. That's your body trying to increase the surface area to have exchange with the air and get rid of some of that heat. If your body is trying to maintain that heat, you're going to have vasoconstriction, where you're going to actually close those vessels down further. You're going to shunt that blood away from the skin and away from extremities. If you are trying to warm yourself, and you're a mammal, you're going to go to that brown adipose tissue burning and then potentially shivering thermogenesis. If you're trying to cool yourself, you could sweat or you could pant. So we'll talk more about these different ways that the body can perform both of these functions. So when it comes to reducing hair loss, most of our animals have either, well, I shouldn't say that. Our birds have feathers, our mammals have hair, and both of these can play a role with the addition of piloerection. This is where you actually have changes in the orientation of these keratin structures, and you have little muscles that are going to allow them to go and stand up a little straighter. So goosebumps, this is piloerection. And what this does is, it's not quite as good with us, although it works a little bit, but if you have a furry body and you get goosebumps, what you've done is you've created a layer of air trapped between the hair and the body, and that can act as insulation in order to maintain a certain temperature. So if you've ever seen a bird in the winter and they're all fluffed up like a little fluff ball, they're thermoregulating. They're trying to maintain this heat layer between their bodies and the feathers. All right, again, we can have these changes in how the blood is flowing through the body, and this is called a vasomotor response, to be able to actually control where your blood is being shunted. So if you're cold, you're going to keep that away from the skin. You don't want to have that exchange with your environment. If you're warm, then you do want that exchange. You want that to be able to take the heat away, and we have shunts within our system in order to either allow that blood to meet surface or to not. In some of our animals, it's also really important to have a countercurrent exchange system, largely around big muscles. So some of our really big deep sea fish are going to rely really heavily on this countercurrent exchange, where the big muscles that they're using for swimming are going to produce a certain amount of heat. And by having that exchange between arterioles and the venules, then you end up creating a warmer body for the animal as a whole as the blood moves throughout the system. All right, and so in a lot of animals, sweating and panting is going to be a very large part of cooling the body. In sweating, the body is going to create moisture that will evaporate and pull heat away from the body when it evaporates. Sweating only works really well when it can evaporate. Ever notice you can get really sweaty on a very humid day and you don't feel any cooler because of it? Because the humidity is so high, it's not actually evaporating and pulling that heat away. It can actually trap heat even further in those types of a scenario. That's when you end up with heat strokes. But in an ideal situation, it evaporates and you're a little bit cooler. Some animals rely on panting instead. And there's a lot of heat loss that can happen through that kind of an exchange. When we're looking at mucous membranes, that's a lot of vasculature that is really close to the surface. So these two graphs below are showing a reindeer and their breathing rate in low temperature first. And you can see that they're breathing at a pretty regular rate there. But in a high temperature, suddenly they start panting. So one thing you can notice that's different between the graph on the left and the right is that on the left, they're breathing through their nose more. And on the right, they're breathing mostly through their mouth, except for a little minute in the middle there, where it looks like they closed their mouths and they were breathing through their nose. And then they open their mouths back again. So in order to get the maximal amount of heat exchange, you're going to see this panting behavior at a really high rate to maximize how much heat is ultimately going to be lost there. All right, so that lands us at the end of our thermal lecture. I will see you all soon. Stay well.